"There's no room in the limo," my cousin shrugged as they drove off to Grandpa's funeral without me. I took an Uber in silence. When the will was read, everyone turned to me, and I didn't say a word. I, 32M, stood on the curb watching the black limousine pull away, carrying my aunt, my cousin Derek, and his wife to my grandfather's funeral. The morning air was thick with humidity, and I could feel sweat gathering at my collar despite the early hour. Derek had rolled down the window just enough to shout that there was no room, his tone suggesting this was somehow my fault for not arriving earlier. The limo had space for at least 2 more people. I'd seen it when they loaded in. I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber. The driver arrived in 12 minutes, though it felt longer standing there in my black suit, holding the folded flag I'd brought to place on the casket. Grandpa had served in Korea. He would have appreciated the gesture, but now I wasn't sure I'd even get the chance to present it properly. The funeral home was across town, and traffic was building. My driver, an older man who didn't try to make conversation, navigated through side streets while I stared out the window. I'd flown in from Seattle the night before, taken a red-eye, because that was all I could afford on short notice. My grandfather and I had been close when I was younger, before college, before I moved away for work. The last 5 years I'd only seen him twice, both times brief visits during holidays when the whole family gathered, and there was never enough time to really talk. He'd called me 3 months ago, late at night, his voice thin over the phone. He told me he was proud of what I'd built for myself, that working my way through community college and then transferring to finish my degree while working full-time showed character. He said he remembered when I was 8 and had stayed up all night helping him fix his old truck, how I hadn't complained once even though we didn't finish until dawn. The conversation had lasted an hour. He made me promise to visit soon. I'd promised, but work got busy, and then he was gone. The Uber pulled up to the funeral home 30 minutes after the service had started. I paid, thanked the driver, and walked up the steps alone. Inside, the lobby was empty except for a guest book on a wooden stand. I signed my name, noting that I was near the bottom of a long list. Through the double doors, I could hear someone speaking, their voice measured and solemn. I slipped into the back row. The chapel was full. My grandfather had known everyone in this town, had run a small construction business for 40 years, and apparently never made an enemy. The rows were packed with men in work boots and women clutching tissues. Up front, I could see my aunt sitting in the first row, Derek beside her. The casket was closed, draped with flowers. The service continued. People spoke about Grandpa's generosity, his work ethic, his terrible jokes. A pastor I didn't recognize talked about faith and legacy. I sat quietly, the flag still folded in my lap. When they asked if anyone else wanted to share memories, I considered standing, but Derek was already walking to the podium. He talked about family dinners and fishing trips, stories I remembered being part of, but where he somehow made himself the central character. After the service, people filed out to their cars for the procession to the cemetery. I ended up riding with a couple I didn't know, friends of my grandfather who had an extra seat and offered it when they saw me standing alone. At the graveside, I finally approached the casket and placed the flag on top, tucking it beside the flowers. My aunt saw me do it. She looked away. The burial was brief. Military honors, 3 rifle volleys, a bugler playing taps. Then it was over, and people were drifting toward their cars, talking about the reception at my aunt's house. I started walking to the parking lot, planning to call another Uber, when a man in a gray suit approached me. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, my grandfather's attorney. He asked if I was planning to attend the reading of the will, scheduled for that afternoon at his office downtown. I hadn't known there was a will reading. No one had mentioned it. Mr. Harrison seemed surprised by this, then handed me a business card with the address and time. 2 o'clock. 3 hours away. I skipped the reception. Instead, I found a diner near the attorney's office and sat in a booth, drinking coffee and picking at a sandwich I couldn't really taste. The server kept refilling my cup without asking. At 1:30, I walked to the address on the card, a brick building with Harrison and Associates etched into a brass plaque by the door. The receptionist checked my ID and led me to a conference room. I was the first one there. The room had a long table, leather chairs, and windows overlooking the street. I sat near the middle and waited. At 5 minutes to 2, my aunt arrived with Derek and his wife. They stopped in the doorway when they saw me, clearly not expecting my presence. Derek asked what I was doing there. I told him Mr. Harrison had invited me. My aunt's expression tightened, but she took a seat at the far end of the table. Mr. Harrison entered at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a leather folder and a sealed envelope. He sat at the head of the table, opened the folder, and began explaining the standard legal preliminaries about the probate process. My aunt kept glancing at me, then at Derek. Derek was on his phone until Mr. Harrison asked him to put it away. The attorney opened the sealed envelope and removed several pages. He explained that my grandfather had updated his will 6 weeks before his death, that he'd been of sound mind, and that everything had been properly witnessed and notarized. Then he started reading. The house, the one my grandparents had lived in for 50 years, went to my aunt. That made sense. She'd lived in this town her whole life, had taken care of Grandma during her final years. There were some smaller bequests to local charities, a few $1,000s to the church. Derek received my grandfather's truck and his tools, which seemed appropriate given that Derek had taken over the construction business. Then Mr. Harrison paused, looked directly at me, and continued reading. Everything else went to me. The savings accounts, the investment portfolio my grandfather had quietly built over decades, the life insurance policy, a safe deposit box, and a property I didn't know existed. The total value was substantial, more money than I'd expected by several orders of magnitude. Enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house, maybe start my own business. The room went silent. My aunt stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She demanded to know if this was some kind of mistake. Mr. Harrison assured her it was not, that my grandfather had been very specific about his wishes. He'd even included a letter, sealed, addressed to me personally. The attorney handed it across the table. Derek was on his feet now too, his face red. He asked why I deserved anything, pointed out that I'd barely visited, that I'd moved away and built a new life while he'd stayed and worked in the family business. My aunt joined in, her voice rising as she listed all the ways she'd been there for her father, all the doctor's appointments she'd driven him to, all the meals she'd cooked, all the years of care. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, holding the envelope with my name written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. Mr. Harrison explained that the will was ironclad, that my grandfather had been very deliberate, that he'd anticipated there might be questions, and had included detailed documentation of his reasoning. Derek demanded to see that documentation. Mr. Harrison pulled out another folder, this one thick with papers. Bank statements showing regular large transfers from my grandfather's account to my aunt's account over the past 10 years. Credit card bills in my grandfather's name for purchases he'd never made. Receipts for expensive items, jewelry, and electronics, all charged to him, but delivered to Derek's address. A timeline of medical appointments where my aunt had claimed to be present, but security footage and sign-in logs showed she hadn't attended. The file contained years of evidence, meticulously gathered, documenting a pattern of financial elder abuse. My aunt went pale. She started to speak, then stopped. Derek was staring at the documents, his earlier anger replaced with something that looked like panic. Mr. Harrison explained that my grandfather had hired a private investigator 8 months ago after noticing irregularities in his accounts. The investigator had uncovered everything. My grandfather had consulted with Adult Protective Services but decided against pressing charges, choosing instead to handle the matter through his will. The attorney continued. My grandfather had specifically instructed that I was not to be told about any of this before his death. He didn't want me flying out and confronting anyone, didn't want drama during his final months. He wanted peace, but he also wanted justice, and he wanted me taken care of by family members who had actually cared about him rather than his money. The letter in my hand suddenly felt heavier. I looked at my aunt, at Derek's wife who hadn't said a word but had clearly known what was happening. I thought about the limousine that morning, about being left on the curb, about 5 years of rare phone calls and canceled visits. I thought about my grandfather sitting alone in his house, discovering that his own daughter was stealing from him, and how much that must have hurt. I stood up, tucked the letter into my jacket pocket, and thanked Mr. Harrison for his time. My aunt tried to speak to me, started saying something about misunderstandings and how things weren't what they looked like. I walked past her without responding. Derek stepped into my path, said we needed to talk about this, that there was family business to settle. I moved around him and kept walking. In the lobby, the receptionist handed me a separate envelope, smaller, with instructions from my grandfather. Inside was a key to the safe deposit box and an address for the property I'd inherited. The property was local, just 15 minutes away. I decided to see it before flying home. The Uber driver who picked me up was different from the morning's driver, younger, more talkative. She asked how my day was going. I told her it had been complicated. She laughed and said that was the most honest answer she'd heard all week. The address led to a modest workshop on 2 acres, set back from the road behind a row of old oak trees. The building was metal-sided, weathered but solid, with a gravel parking area and a hand-painted sign that read Sullivan Construction, EST 1975. My grandfather's business. The original location before he'd expanded and moved to a larger facility that Derek now ran. This property had been kept separate, apparently, maintained but unused for the past decade. I used the key Mr. Harrison had given me and opened the main door. Inside was equipment, tools, materials, everything needed to run a small construction operation. There was also a small office in the back, and on the desk was another envelope with my name on it. This letter was longer, written in my grandfather's careful script. He explained that he'd known about the theft for months before hiring the investigator, that he'd wanted to believe there was some mistake or explanation. The investigation had confirmed his fears. He wrote about disappointment, about how hard it was to realize that his own daughter saw him as nothing more than a source of money. He wrote about Derek, who he'd trained and mentored, who had learned the business and then learned how to skim from the accounts. But mostly, he wrote about me. About the night we fixed his truck, about conversations we'd had over the years, about how I'd chosen a different path, but had done it honestly, working my way through school without asking for handouts. He wrote that he saw integrity in that, and character. He said he wished we'd had more time, that he should have been more direct in his final months about wanting me to visit. He'd been afraid of seeming needy, of being a burden. The letter ended with instructions. The workshop was mine to do with as I pleased. I could sell it, rent it, or use it. He suggested I might want to start my own business, that the equipment and location were perfect for it, that he'd always thought I had the mind for building things even if I'd chosen to build with code instead of lumber. He said the money in the accounts was for security, for freedom to make choices without desperation. He said he was proud of me. He signed it Grandpa, with a small note underneath. The flag was a nice touch. I sat in that office for a long time, reading the letter 3 times, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Text messages from Derek, from my aunt, even from Derek's wife. I didn't read them. Instead, I called Mr. Harrison and asked about the timeline for probate, about when I could access the accounts, about what my responsibilities would be regarding the estate. He walked me through everything, explained that it would take a few months, but that the will was solid and there was no legitimate grounds for contest given the documented evidence. That evening, I walked around the property. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink. The workshop sat quiet, waiting. I thought about my job in Seattle, about the apartment I rented, about the life I'd built that was comfortable but not particularly fulfilling. I thought about what it would mean to move back here, to start something new, to take the gift my grandfather had given me and actually build something with it. My phone rang. It was my aunt. I let it go to voicemail. Then Derek called. Voicemail. Then my aunt again. I turned the phone off and sat on the workshop steps, watching the sky darken. Somewhere in town, my family was probably gathering, discussing strategy, trying to figure out how to contest the will or convince me to share the inheritance. They'd argue that I should be reasonable, that family was more important than money, that we should work something out. But they hadn't thought about family that morning when they drove away in the limousine. They hadn't thought about it during the years they were stealing from an old man who trusted them. They thought about it now only because they'd lost access to money they'd considered rightfully theirs, money they'd been planning to inherit. I stayed at the workshop until the stars came out. Eventually, I called another Uber and headed back to my hotel. The driver asked if I was in town for business or pleasure. I told him I was there for a funeral, but that I might be moving back. He said the town could use some new blood, that too many young people left and never came back. I said I was starting to see the appeal of returning. At the hotel, I finally turned my phone back on. 23 missed calls, 14 text messages, 2 voicemails. I deleted everything without reading or listening. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching what it would take to restart a construction business, what licenses I'd need, what the market looked like. I had a degree in computer science, but I'd grown up around construction sites, had spent summers working for my grandfather before college. The skills were still there, buried under years of coding and project management. The next morning, I visited the safe deposit box. Inside was more documentation, deeds and titles and insurance policies, but also personal items. My grandfather's military medals, photos of my grandmother, a watch that had belonged to his father, a small notebook filled with sketches of building projects, ideas he'd never gotten around to completing. At the bottom was a final note, just a single line: build something that matters. I spent another day in town, meeting with Mr. Harrison to sign papers and establish a timeline for the estate. I drove past my aunt's house, but didn't stop. I visited my grandfather's grave alone, placing a small stone on the headstone in the tradition he'd taught me as a child. I thanked him, standing there in the cemetery, and promised I'd think carefully about what to do with everything he'd left behind. On the flight back to Seattle, I drafted my resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice, professional and brief. I'd saved enough to cover the gap, while probate was processing and I got established. The workshop needed some updates, but it was functional. The equipment was older but well-maintained. I could start small, take on residential projects, maybe specialize in restoration work for historic buildings. The town had plenty of those. 3 months later, I was back in town permanently. Sullivan Construction was operational again, this time with me at the helm. I'd hired 2 local guys who needed work, both skilled and reliable. We'd landed our first major contract, a renovation of the old library building downtown. The money from my grandfather's estate sat in an account, growing, a safety net that let me make decisions based on what was right rather than what was profitable. My aunt tried to reach out once through a mutual cousin. She wanted to explain, to reconcile, to find some way forward. I sent back a message through the same cousin. There was nothing to explain, nothing to reconcile. Some actions had consequences that couldn't be undone with apologies. Derek I saw occasionally around town. We didn't speak. His business was struggling, I'd heard, though I didn't pay much attention to the details. He'd made his choices. I'd made mine. The workshop became more than just a business. I kept my grandfather's office exactly as he'd left it, and sometimes, late at night when I was working on estimates or designs, I'd sit at his desk and feel like he was still there, guiding me, proud of what I was building. Not just buildings, but a life that had meaning, connected to something older and more important than quarterly profits or career advancement. I never did say a word to them that day in the attorney's office. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any argument ever could. And sometimes the best revenge is simply living well with what you've been given, honoring those who believed in you even when you couldn't see it yourself. The flag I'd placed on my grandfather's casket had been folded properly and sent to me by the funeral home. It sat now in my workshop office, in a display case on the wall, a reminder of service and sacrifice and the quiet dignity of a man who'd built his life with his hands and left behind something worth inheriting. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot to us.